Ultimately tonight, what we'll be talking about is private pilot stumper questions. So some of these questions that you might get stumped on your private pilot oral. Obviously, most of you guys probably already are private pilots, but it could be fun, a little fun refresher of thinking back to some of that stuff that you might have known once upon a time, or at least should have known. And some of these things you just don't necessarily think about until you encounter them in real life. So, what we'll kind of talk about, like I said, is things that we should know from your private pilot check ride, stuff that will really actually help you in the real world when you're flying your airplane, questions that cause some private pilot students to fail a check ride. And then a lot of these questions or they're all questions that I ask my students during their flight reviews when they come in for a BFR or something like that. Um, and then these are also questions that the annoying guy in the FBO always likes to ask because he thinks he's the only one that knows the answer. And now, after this presentation, hopefully, you guys will have some of these stumper questions that you can ask other people that think they know it all and you can prove them wrong. So, hopefully, it'll be useful for everyone, kind of jog your memory a little bit. It's going to be really open discussion. I'd love to hear from everybody else. I'll ask the question, and I'm not going to move on until somebody is brave enough to click unmute and take a shot at it. And then we'll talk about the why and how. And anybody can stop me at any time and ask a question. Just go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question. This is really an open discussion, not so much of a lecture or presentation, but just kind of a round table of hopefully all of us learn a little bit more tonight. So to get started with the first one, is I want to know how long is the runway and what is the total distance available for landing? So hopefully this is appearing good enough on your screens. You can see that we've got the little airport information section here for Sarasota, Bradenton International. And looking here at that little zoomed in section there, I want to know what is the total distance available for landing on their longest runway at Sarasota, Bradenton International.
9,500.
Yeah, it makes sense. 9,500 feet. The problem is that's how long the longest piece of pavement is. It's not how long is available for landing. So we'll take an example here of Madison Municipal Airport. Madison Municipal Airport says 3,800 feet available for landing. Makes sense. But when we look at the runway, we can see that when we're coming into land here, this displaced threshold is about a third of the runway. So we're actually giving up about a little over 1,000 feet in the displaced threshold. And if we looked at Sarasota, we would find the exact same thing. We'd find that there's really only about 7,000 some feet available for landing. Obviously, in most of our airplanes, that's not a problem at all. Not until it comes to an airport like this. And maybe, this one's actually in Georgia, Madison. But if you're looking at a 3,800 foot long runway on a hot summer day in July, and the airport elevation was 6,000 feet, you might say, oh, no problem. I can land there, without any issue at all, and certainly take off out of there. And while you might be able to use all that distance for takeoff, the landing might be a little more interesting when you find out, oh, there's big obstacles here on this end of the runway, and I'm going to be coming in smoking fast at that high density altitude, and I've actually only got about 2,000 some feet available for landing. So little things that can kind of get you. It's the length of the longest piece of pavement at the airport doesn't mean it's the distance available for landing. A little asterisk that none of us ever really bothered to read on the side of that sectional chart legend when we're looking through all that stuff. So any questions on that one?
Well, the displaced threshold is often paved.
Right? It is paved, but you wouldn't want to use it for landing necessarily, right?
You're not supposed to, certainly, but
not supposed to. Yeah. The reason that it exists in the first place is there's going to be some sort of an obstacle, and so they don't just put it in there and say, hey, if you can land before this thing, great. We don't want you using this much for landing, so we shorten the runway. The problem with it, it's not that the runway can't support our weight, in a Cessna or a Piper. It might be that this part of the runway can't support the weight of a landing aircraft. For a jet, most of us probably don't fly jets. But there is going to be some sort of obstacle that's going to keep you high, and it's going to keep you high. And if you're high, you're probably going to wind up being a little fast, and it's going to be hard to get down and land before the threshold, aside from that whole nagging legality part of when those FAA guys is, having a cup of coffee at the FBO there, and you land before the threshold and then taxi in, and he says, hey, did you land before the threshold? And you went, yeah, it's a STOL competition, right? I landed as short as I could. And he goes, oh, I got to talk to you for a minute there. So
Yeah. Well, the
Always
flip
hate those
side of that is
conversations.
that you're supposed to land in 2,300 feet, which, 172 or 182 could do, but I wouldn't want
Sure.
to do it
And
in a
then,
Mooney.
yeah, I mean, all of a sudden, though, 2,000 feet's pretty good for a 172 or 182 until it's 6,000 foot, airport elevation and it's, 80 degrees outside and, you got that 2 knot tailwind or something, or, wind's variable at 6. And you go, oh, I'm going to land on this runway. And you find out, you're just smoking along a little fast there. And the runway gets pretty short pretty quick, once you actually get down there to look at it. So um, that's that's that one anyways. That little gotcha there. That can certainly get you on a private pilot check ride. And it might be a little surprising in real life when you're expecting 3,800 feet and you find out you only got 2,000 some available. Next one I got for you, found one out here in Colorado. If you're approaching from the north to land runway 29, can you enter a right base and land? I mean, it makes good sense, if you're just coming down from the north, just hook in there on a right base and land. Can you do that? Anybody want to take a shot at it at what is that, Burnt County or?
Yeah, I was trying to figure out what it is. Cannon City?
Oh, let me
It's
take a
Brown.
I think it's
Right.
Fremont County.
Fremont County.
Yeah,
Fremont County. Okay. So
That's left traffic for 29.
doesn't say right traffic, does it?
Doesn't say right traffic, but from a legal standpoint, can you do it? I mean, it's awfully convenient if you're just coming in here, nobody's in the pattern, just to hang a right and swing on in there.
I think you can do it if nobody's in the way.
Yeah, I mean, and a lot of people do that, and you'll even hear people call up, you might be on a left crosswind and somebody calls up and they say, I'm going to make a right base. And you're like, okay, yeah, no problem. That doesn't matter to me any. That should work just fine. Again, when you got that annoying FAA guy that's sitting there in the FBO having his coffee and he sees you do that, there's going to be a little conversation about 91 126 and 91 127. So what we've got in here is 126 127 covers airports basically that are non-towered, class E and G airspace, and all it says is direction of turns. They have to be to the left unless it says right traffic, meaning from a legal standpoint, you legally have to make left traffic even if it makes way more sense to make right traffic. Sometimes there's clouds on the left downwind, and it just makes more sense, oh, it's kind of low clouds hanging out there on the left downwind about 1,000 feet AGL, but it's clear on the north side of the airport. I'd rather just go ahead and make right traffic. That makes the most sense here. From a legal standpoint, somebody can definitely ruffle your feathers a little bit and say, hey, 91 126, 91 127 says you got to make left turns, unless it says otherwise. The it doesn't prohibit you from making a straight in approach, but it would prohibit you from a right downwind, a right crosswind, a right base, all of that. The reality of it is, obviously, you got to do what's safe to operate your aircraft. A check right answer, of course, would be no. I would only make left turns. If there's clouds there on the left downwind, I would go somewhere else. Where you get dinged on this is somebody's got to be there. They either got to see you do it or you got to cause a conflict with another aircraft. And if they see you do it, it might be something as simple as a conversation of like, hey, check out these regs, just so you know, you're not supposed to do that. Don't do it again. No worries. If you cause a conflict with another aircraft because nobody's on the radio, but somebody was flying their J3 Cub with no electrical system and no radio, and they're out there on a left base and you start coming on a right base and this guy sees you and freaks out and has to turn and maybe you never even see him and you go in and land and he comes in behind you all upset, the FAA will get a little bit more uptight about you making that right base or right downwind or whatever it might be when you go in there and approach Fremont County or any other non-towered airport for that matter. Of course, towered airports, they'll tell you how to enter the pattern, so no sweat off your back. You don't have to worry about it. But just some of those more obscure regs that, I mean, I don't have time to read the whole FAR AIM, but if you do enough flying, you'll make enough of these mistakes. People will tell you, hey, there's some more reading to do in there. So does all that make sense for everybody? Cool. Awesome.
Just from my perspective, it's always, safe to clear the area and just crossing either midfield or, to do your left base. It's just a lot easier.
Yeah, and those 500 foot above traffic pattern overflights are really nice. You get to check out the windsock and really see what it's doing because the AWOS will say one thing, the windsock will tell you another thing. There might be multiple windsocks on the field that'll tell you, hey, there's some pretty swirly winds down there. They don't all agree, and it gives you a full 360 picture of the airport. There might be somebody taxiing out without a radio that doesn't have any lights turned on, doesn't have any strobes, nothing, and you just see them moving on the surface, and you realize, okay, there's some movement down there. I need to keep my eye out and not be surprised when he taxis out across the runway when I'm on final. There's certainly still a lot of guys, and at least here in Utah, certainly in Alaska, and probably in Colorado as well, to fly at those high density altitudes and they're underpowered airplanes, they're ripping out the starter and the flywheel and the alternator and the radios and all that other stuff, and they save 100 pounds. It makes a big difference. And but they're flying around with no radio. So even we were at a STOL competition in Yuma this past weekend, and one of the guys, really impressive, 40-foot takeoffs and 60-foot landings and stuff in a P-18 Super Cub with slats, and he's hand propping that 180 horsepower airplane because he doesn't have any sort of electrical system on it. So but yeah, if you guys have any questions at all, feel free to stop me. Another thing that while we're talking about this, it's worth mentioning, it's kind of an oddball one, is we're used to the 500-foot overfly the traffic pattern deal. So that makes sense, right? So we're going to overfly the airport and at 500 feet, look down and then enter on a left downwind at a 45-degree angle. All that makes good sense. There's a less well-known modified traffic pattern entry that some people like to do. And we'll get the screen swapped over here. That would be this guy. So believe it or not, the FAA somehow or another approved this as a preferred method or alternate midfield entry. So hopefully that's legible enough for everybody. This is what we're used to. We fly over the airport, pattern altitude plus 500 feet. We come back around, 45-degree entry into the left downwind. Alternatively, you enter at traffic pattern altitude and cross over the field at traffic pattern altitude and join from the inner part of that downwind at a 45-degree angle. And why? I guess perhaps for everybody flying around that can't see that windsock quite as well, you get to be 500 feet lower. Maybe you're already low doing that. But this is an approved way to enter. In my personal opinion, it's not something we really teach students other than we just teach them to watch out for it. Watch out for people doing that because it is an approved way, but it's not necessarily the most sensible or safe way to go about joining the traffic pattern. So that's and that's something we see a lot of this more so up in Alaska. People like to fly low. Rarely do you see anybody flying more than 1,000 feet AGL anyways up there. So that's a more common way that they kind of approach runways up there. And possibly, I mean, if you're at super high density altitudes, you might see some of that in Colorado in the summertime where guys can't, it would take them all day to climb an extra 500 feet above pattern altitude. So they're just cruising along 1,000 feet AGL. Get the screen swapped back here. This is one of my personal favorites that I always ask students or anyone on a flight review or just anyone in general. What is your minimum RPM for takeoff? So somebody go ahead and unmute and tell me what kind of airplane you're flying and what is the minimum RPM you can take off at?
I fly a 182 and it's not based on RPMs. We put the prop all the way in and, just take off at 50 to 55 knots, pull back and.
Sure.
Well,
How do you know?
There's a minimum RPM.
Yeah, so that would be a constant speed prop. And so a little bit different between fixed pitch and constant speeds, but I'm glad you brought up the constant speed. If that constant speed prop, on your 182, is it redline at 2,600 or 2,700?
About 2650. And
2,650.
in the red, and as soon as we get 200 feet off the ground, we back it off to 2450.
Sure.
So in the green.
So would you take off if you added, full power and had the prop full forward and it was spinning, say, 2,500 RPM? Would you take off?
Yes, I think so. But it usually doesn't. Mhm.
It usually would be making 2650, and that's the proper thing. So for a constant speed propeller airplane, you're supposed to make basically red line, or basically, right up there, a set number every time, regardless of density, altitude, regardless of weather. If you have, anything more than 20 inches of manifold pressure, then you should be developing full power, and you should be getting full RPM out of the thing. And if you're not, there could be something wrong. There could be your mags might not be timed right. You could have really fouled up plugs. You could have like we said, bad timing on the mags. You could have bad fuel. You could, you're not making full power for some reason. You could have the carburetor heat on. There could be, some sort of exhaust leak that's not allowing the airplane to make full power. A number of different reasons. And as pilots, when we're on the takeoff roll, you had full power. Your attention needs to be outside the airplane, looking down the runway, making sure nobody's going to have an incursion on your runway. Nobody's going to be driving a truck out there or pulling an airplane out in front of you. And also, like Martin said, being aware for your airspeed, when to rotate, all of that. And you want to glance at your instruments and make sure you got oil pressure, and you want to make sure that you got the proper RPM, because that'll tell you that you're making good power. It's hard with the constant speed airplane because the airplane actually could not be making full power and yet still be turning the proper RPM. But if it's not turning proper RPM, it's definitely not making full power. There could be a prop governor issue. And if we're not making full RPM, even if the engine's in great shape, without the full RPM, we're not making full power. All of our climb metrics are off. All of our takeoff distances are off. Nothing that's in the book can we really count on. So all that goes out the window. So from a pilot perspective, we just have a simple yes or no question that we have to ask ourselves when we take off. And that is, am I making the proper RPM, proper power? And if it's not, then I stop. I abort the takeoff before it barely even gets going in the first 10 or 20 knots, as I'm rolling down the runway. Now, who wants to take a stab at it for something like a fixed pitch propeller airplane, like a
Yeah,
172?
we fly out of the Air Force Academy, and we have a minimum of 2,250
Yep.
for 172s. And if they're not making 2,250, we abort.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. And so that's a fixed pitch prop. And where do you get that number from?
It's in our checklist.
It's on your checklist. Okay, cool. And now let me ask you this. Is that an FAA approved checklist?
No, we make up our own.
You make up your own. And that's fine. I mean, you might have made it up off of, FAA approved documents, like from the POH. And a lot of people tell me, oh, my minimum RPM for takeoff, 2250, and I'll find that in the POH, or it's the green arc. And, we can see on this tachometer, we certainly wouldn't want to take off in a 172 that's only turning, 1900 RPM.
No.
So that number, 2250, let's say you put a different propeller on the airplane, or you do some sort of change. You got to kind of ask yourself, where does this number come from? How do I know? It's on the checklist, and hey, it worked last Tuesday. It should work again next Thursday. I went flying and it was more than 2250. Everything was great. And the question becomes, where did that information come from? And is the checklist correct? Does anybody want to take a shot at it? No takers.
Well, yeah, sure. You can, if you change the pitch on the prop,
Mm-hmm.
That's I had a pitch special I got with a friend, and someone had the prop pitched at 53.
Yep.
And the plane I had was all the way at 58. So we tweaked his up, because as soon as you got in the downline, that prop would just spin up so quick.
Yeah. And so your static RPM would be a lot higher in that case. And for any fixed pitch propeller airplane, they'll always give you a range. So where we're going to find this is on the TCDS, which is the type certificate data sheet from the FAA. And you'll find this for any certified airplane. For this particular one, I just pulled up a random TCDS, and this one applies to a PA-28, a Piper Cherokee, 160 horse. And it tells us it's approved for, these airplanes from 1960 onward for these serial numbers. And so it gives us a serial number range and tells us, hey, this airplane's built with a Lycoming 0320, and it has these carburetor settings that you could find in a carburetor manual, and this is the fuel it needs. And for all operations, never exceed 2,700 RPM, which would give you 160 horse. And then it'll tell you, based on the type of propeller you have, a Sensenik 74-inch DM or 74 DM6, and that starts referring to pitch, and these serial numbers on the propeller, then your static RPM is going to be not over 2425 and not under 2325. and it'll say right there, no additional tolerance permitted, diameter of the prop. And props vary in diameter. It might start off as a 74-inch propeller from the factory, but after, some nicks and dings and some filing at annual after, 20, 30, 40 years, that prop might be a little smaller. And they say, hey, this prop can't get any smaller than 72.5. And we don't want anything more than 74 because based on how much that nose strut compresses and the clearance between the propeller and the pavement, we need it to be no more than 74 inches unless you're going to upgrade your tire or something like that, say, or put on a bigger nose gear. So this is the document we'd refer to that'll tell us things like, hey, your RPM and that 2250 that you're getting on the 172 comes probably most likely right from this document. Rarely is it mentioned in POHs. It's going to be mentioned in this document because this is how they actually certify the airplane with the FAA. And it'll say for a specific propeller, specific engine combination, this is the RPM range you're looking for. And, if you take that propeller to a prop shop and they repitch it, no, none of this really works. But they should know what you pitched it to, and they should be able to give you the math behind it of, hey, what does this number need to be? And this is an instant, if it's below 2325, instantly telling you that, hey, this isn't going to work. This is not making full power for some reason. We don't know why. It could be that bad timing, bad fuel, low compression, stuck valve, anything. Doesn't matter. You don't have to worry about all this stuff as a pilot. You just have to know this number. And if it's below that, abort your takeoff because your climb rate's not going to be good. Your takeoff distance isn't going to be good. All that stuff is going to be out the window.
So the static RPM that's referenced there is when you start to accelerate, you're looking for that 2250 or 2425
Right.
or between 23 and 25 and 2425. Got it.
Exactly. Yep. And that's going to be that instant that you apply full power. And of course, we don't want to hold the brakes every time we take off and set full power and sit there for 2 or 3 seconds and say, oh, is this good? Okay, now I can release the brakes because you'll quickly go from that 74-inch prop down to that 72.5-inch prop with all the little nicks and dings you're going to get in it. But as you add full power, right as you slide into full, glance at that tack. And for me, sometimes I put a little grease pencil mark on there, or I just remember the angle of that needle where it should be pointing. And I say, yep, it's good. And my thing is, full power, gauges green, airspeed alive. And gauges green means oil pressure and RPM. Those are my two big things that I'm looking at. I've already checked oil temperature. I've already checked everything else. And so gauges green is simply, I still got oil pressure and I've got the proper RPM. If I glance at that on the takeoff roll and the second I look away, boom, my oil pump goes out and I lose oil pressure, I probably will still be able to, if you guys watch the video we put out of the Cherokee that we ran out of oil on purpose and how long we ran it for at full power, you'll probably be able to take off, notice that lack of oil pressure in the pattern, come back around and land, and probably barely do any damage to the engine, let alone have an engine failure. Losing oil pressure right at rotation doesn't mean the engine's going to just stop instantly. At least not on these old Lycoming Continental motors that are air cooled, that are pretty loose to begin with. And some of these Rotaxes and Yamahas and the newer stuff is a lot less friendly to low oil pressure or improper temperatures. But that static RPM, just to be clear about it, is minimum airflow through the prop. So right when you add full power, as soon as you start accelerating down the runway, of course, the RPM is going to come up and get, probably above 24, 25, or it could be below 2300 and then come up into that range as you start accelerating. That doesn't mean that's acceptable. Static means stationary. So as close to stationary as possible, but no need to hold the brakes and apply full power and tear up that prop, especially on gravel. So any more questions on static RPM?
I was watching your video at lunch today, and I learned that for the first time. So it was kind of shocking when you presented that, because in all my years of flying, no one's ever talked to me about that.
The oil pressure or static RPM?
The static RPM.
Yeah.
And I was wondering from, like this is a Piper, and if you went to a Cessna or something, could you basically use a rule of thumb, anything 100 less than 100 RPM from your max that you generally been running?
You really can't. And the reason why is airplanes get a lot more varied than this. You'll start to see This is just one RPM range on here, but there's many 172s that came from the factory back in the 60s, 70s, or 2010 with an option for a climb or a cruise prop, and that can be a difference of 200 RPM for static RPM.
wow.
And so you'll really actually, when the airplane goes through 100-hour, goes through annual, want to go ahead and take a look. The other option, aside from actually popping the spinner, waiting for them to pull the spinner to annual, and reading what the actual model and serial number is on the prop to compare it and make sure you got the right one. The other option is to go back to your logbooks and see what propeller is installed on there. I mean, it's totally it doesn't surprise me at all though when I look at a 1965 Cessna and what the prop that's supposed to be on there according to the logbooks is not the propeller on the plane, or it's been repitched. But typically if it's been repitched and they twisted the blades, they literally bent them, on a fixed pitch prop and just bent that metal to a different pitch setting, they'll typically make a notation of it in the logbooks. And if for some reason, you do all this work, you pull up the TCDS, how you do it is as simple as going to Google and typing in FAA TCDS, and then it's a little bit of a process. We'll go ahead and for anybody that's curious, I'll share this window here. And so what I'll do is simply go to Google, type in FAA TCDS, and so that I get my RGL, my regulations.fa.gov, and I'm going to say I want to search this by make, my type certificate holder. And I'm going to say I want a Piper, P, or even like, how about a Cessna, which is really weird. It's under T because it's Textron. It's actually not Cessna. Cessna's been out of business for a long time. We go Textron Aviation. And now I say, okay, I got a Cessna 172 N. I click on that and it tells me my TCDS number is 3 Alpha 12. And guess what? 3 Alpha 12 is the exact same TCDS number as a 172B, because when I click on 3 Alpha 12, it brings me to this page. I click on this link, revision 85, and you'll see that this thing applies to 172 plane all the way through 172S. So going back from the very first one in 1956 all the way up to August 14th, 2019. So this covers a lot of different 172s. And if I just scroll to a random one like a 172 Charlie, here it's telling me propeller Macaulay, and I've got all these different options for my propeller. And then I got another propeller for the seaplane only. And then I got a propeller instead of Macaulay Sensenik, and different RPM settings for each. So that's where it becomes pretty important to actually look at this thing and make sure, hey, I still got a Continental 0300 Charlie or 0300 Delta on there. Of course, if you got a Lycoming 0360 on this airplane now, all bets are off. You'd want to go ahead and talk to the STC holder to say, hey, in your testing, what changed here? A supplemental type certificate modifies the type certificate data sheet. And that's what this is, type certificate data sheet. So this is what you're modifying with an STC. And that STC holder would have to be able to provide the data to the FAA before they get their STC approved of what exactly they're changing on here and what the new specifications are. And that's the beauty of a certified airplane, is all this obnoxious paperwork, which seems very obnoxious until you really want to know this stuff. And one day you're flying an experimental airplane and none of this stuff exists for experimental aircraft, and you really want to know it and you just flat out don't have it. And you go, oh, well, all that obnoxious paperwork actually is good for something. But obviously this is why a brand new 172 costs, one of the many reasons why it costs $500,000 when it should cost half of that.
Don't feel bad about not knowing it. I didn't know about this till I got through my commercial, or those working on my commercial.
So
Yeah.
is there any accommodation for density altitude? I mean, we operate 6, 7, 8,000 feet here all the time. There are,
Yep.
It seems to me, I'm thinking through it. I know I'm not making the full power that I'm making at sea level.
Right. And temperature, yeah, I mean, temperature, pressure, density, altitude ultimately changes a lot of that stuff. So to that effect, you probably know if you're flying a 172, you're probably familiar with your best bet on your best speed is 8,500 feet. And you think, oh, I'll just keep climbing up higher and going faster and faster. And that doesn't really work with a piston naturally aspirated engine. They make best power with a whole combination of things at a certain altitude. I'm trying to find the cruise performance chart, if I can, in here, to use as an example, where it'll show you actually your best speed is going to be up there right around 8,500. But in any case, all that stuff aside, yes, static RPM will absolutely fluctuate with density altitude. It will always be in that range on up to your service ceiling of 14,000 feet. If you're trying to take off at 13,000 feet density altitude, highly unrecommended. Um, but if you are trying to do that, you should still be making that minimum static RPM, despite the fact that the engine's not getting a lot of oxygen to breathe and not making a lot of power. There's also less air for that propeller to push against and less resistance for it. So it all kind of balances out. And that's why there is a range there. If it didn't matter based on density altitude, they wouldn't give you a range, because 180 horsepower should always be 180 horsepower, always. But that's why we're getting those ranges in there.
Got it. Thanks.
Any other questions on static RPM? Cool.
So I guess if you were to have a turbocharged fixed pitch airplane, you get a higher RPM turning at a higher altitude on static.
You should, if you are running, the same manifold pressure. Say you're turbo normalized, you would expect, as temperature increases or as altitude is increasing, to see higher RPMs with the same manifold pressure setting. Of course, if you're boosting to like 45 inches at sea level and then you're only boosting to 40 inches, at higher density altitudes, that's different. But if you're always boosting to the same manifold pressure setting, say you're always boosted to 30 or always boosted to 40, then you should see higher static RPMs with the fixed pitch prop at those higher altitudes. And so that'll give you, ultimately, this is just about knowing if your engine's doing what it's supposed to. It could be running smooth as can be and not making full power. A good example of this is we did an accident case study on on a Mooney that FLY. I should be able to spell my own company name, right? Fly 8MA Mooney. And of course, I'm not going to be able to find the video now. But there was a Mooney that ran off the runway, and that guy, ultimately, he should have known all along, because he was never making full RPM. They knew he wasn't making full RPM because they were able to do, there was a video involved, of course, and they did sound spectrum analysis. For those of you that weren't here earlier and we were talking about the weekend video, or the Alaska weekend video, this was another one we did up there of a very, very fun weekend. So if you guys are bored at all with the winter, not doing much flying, this was another one of our weekend outing adventures up there. But that aside, let me find this
I got
Mooney
it.
video
I'll put it in
here.
the chat.
So you think an aborted takeoff is super easy?
Oh, okay. Somebody found the video.
You got
But
it.
this is that Mooney pilot that, sadly, he realized it. He actually tried to abort just way too late. But all the way down the runway, should have been making 2,700 RPM. He was making like 2,400. And it was an issue with mag timing and just an issue with kind of a tired engine. And it was a constant speed propeller. So again, constant speed propellers should be turning their max RPM always. They should always be turning up at 2,700. There shouldn't be so much of a fluctuation there. That's the prop governor should take care of it. You can have propeller governor issues that would not allow the engine to turn up to full power. That prop cable could become disconnected, or it could be gummed up in there, not allowing the blades to go to a low pitch setting. Any other questions on this stuff? Cool. Awesome. We'll keep scooting along here. Next question I got for you is, why does VA increase as weight increases? And of course, VA decreases as weight decreases. Why is that? And I just realized I'm sharing the wrong window with you guys. Let me share the correct one. There we go. So why is maneuvering speed decreasing when weight decreases? And why does maneuvering speed increase as weight increases? It doesn't make quite sense to me, because if you're telling me that I have a 4.2 G limit and my airplane, for example, is 2,500 pounds, well, that means that my wing can support 10,500 pounds. So if I fly it at 2,000 pounds, I should be able to support 5.25 Gs before I break my wing off. But that's not what they're telling us. They're telling us that, hey, you actually need to fly slower when you weigh less. So who can explain that to me?
It's inertia. It has to do with the way the vehicle reacts to the gust.
That's part of
Well,
it. Yeah.
because-
So you're on the right track there. How's the way?
Because the pitch of your airplane, when you're heavier loaded, is you're a little more nose up to carry the weight. You need more lift, and so you're pitched up a little bit. And when you're lighter, you're more level, and your wings will break off faster. In other words, you'll stall earlier with the heavier.
You'll stall earlier. Exactly. You'll hit that that maximum weight that the wing can really support for a given speed sooner. And so you're really on the right track there. And it all boils back down to this 4.2 G limit. We have G limits on our aircraft, not weight limits. You'll never read on your airplane, hey, the wing supports 10,500 pounds. What they tell you instead is maximum 4.2 Gs. So the reason for this is if we're flying along and maneuvering speed is right here. So basically I can support 4.2 Gs of the speed. If I try to support any more weight, I'll stall and protect myself. And stall is good. This is kind of a bend stuff range. This is a brake stuff range. And this is stall means, well, stall you can recover from as long as you're high enough. So that's great. So what we're trying to avoid is we get confused, or a lot of private pilots get confused and say, oh, well, if my wing supports 10,500 pounds, then I should be able to fly at more than 4.2 Gs at a lower weight. You can't, because there's certain things that don't change. Just because you take weight out of the plane, guess what? Your engine and your prop and your engine mount and all the accessories like your alternator and starter, all that stuff still weighs the same. Your battery, that's pretty darn heavy, still weighs the same. And that battery box is only designed to support, if the battery weighs, say, 30 pounds, it's only designed to support 120 pounds or so, that 4.2 G limit. Try to load it up to more G forces, and now your battery's going to break loose. Now, if we load up to more than 4.2 G forces, it might not be that our wing breaks, but it might be that we start ripping our engine right off the airplane. The actual mount can't attach itself to the firewall with more G loading and more force put on it. Oftentimes in in-flight breakups and turbulence, flying across the Colorado Plateau or something, it's oftentimes not the wing that's failing, it's the tail that's failing first. The horizontal might fail, and then once the horizontal comes off, yes, the wing typically comes off too. So at the end of the day, there's a lot of different ways to explain it, but ultimately, yes, the lighter you are, we can visualize a lot of different ways. The lighter you are, the more you're going to get tossed, the slower you want to fly. So if maneuvering speed is 115 knots placarded in your airplane, that is likely at gross weight. If you're flying below gross weight, you need to slow down well below that. So if it's 115 knots and I'm going to fly at any arbitrary weight, say like 2,000 pounds, then I need to fly below 115. Say my maneuvering speed becomes 102 knots. And then I need to make sure I'm never going to exceed that. So I might target 85 knots or 90 as I'm going through pretty heavy turbulence. And that way, as my airspeed's fluctuating plus or minus 10, I'm never going to exceed my maneuvering speed. If you want to calculate maneuvering speed, think back to that math when we were learning about how we double our speed and we get 4 times as much lift. So for twice as much speed, we get 4 times as much lift. So how do we figure out what maneuvering speed is in our aircraft that don't have this placard? Perhaps it's an experimental aircraft. Perhaps you're flying a kit fox. What is your maneuvering speed? Simple as this. What's your stall speed? If your stall speed, say 40 miles per hour in your kit fox, well, that means at 40 miles per hour, I get 1 G loading. And so if I go ahead and fly at 80 miles per hour, I'm going to get 4 G forces. I'm going to get 4 times as much lift when I double my speed. Well, that brings me right up to about my 4.2 G limit. So my maneuvering speed just became 80 miles an hour. So if you're flying that 172 that says VA 115 knots, but you're flying it 500 pounds under gross weight, go up there and install it. Get nice and high where it's safe, practice a power off stall, and look at what your true airspeed actually is when you're stalling, not indicated. Indicated's not going to be quite right, but get your true airspeed as you're stalling the airplane and double that. That's going to be a safe number to target or try to stay under when you're going through heavy turbulence if you're flying below gross weight. Any questions on that? So this is really annoying when I'm flying my little Rands S20. We just bought this Rands S20, awesome plane. And, we're flying that thing in stall competitions, and it has a stall speed of like 32 miles an hour, 33 miles an hour when we're flying it nice and light. that means that my maneuvering speed becomes 60 or 64, say. And so when I'm in heavy turbulence with that thing, I'm slowing way down. And oftentimes when we're in heavy turbulence, we're probably fighting good headwinds too, which basically means if I got a 30-mile-an-hour headwind, I'm flying in the mountains, I'm probably not flying that day whatsoever because there's no point. I'm just going to get beat up and be making 20, 30 miles an hour progress over the ground. So that's how I find my maneuvering speed. And it's an important number when we start flying in the mountains and any airplane to know that maneuvering speed based on the weight that you're flying at. That's how I find it. I just simply find my true airspeed when I stall the plane and then double that. That becomes my new maneuvering speed for that day at that weight. All good? No questions? Cool. We'll move on to the next one here. Can you go around after you accept a land and hold short clearance? So this example here, we've got Pueblo Memorial Airport, and they have land and hold short operations here. Looks like landing runway 26 left to land and hold short of runway 35. And if you're landing runway 17, you might land and hold short of runway 26 right. So if you are on downwind and the tower says Cessna 12345, clear to land runway 26 left, land and hold short of 35, and you accept that, and you're coming down here and you're floating and you're like, I don't know if I'm going to make it, and you're getting knocked around by turbulence, but they got traffic that's coming in to land on 17, and they're counting on you landing and hold short of runway 17. What happens? What can you do if you're right there? Can you go around at that point, or do you have to land the plane?
I would say you got to do what you can do safely is do a go around.
Yep. And so you can still go around, even if you accept a land and hold short clearance. They would much rather you, once you realize, hey, I floated a whole bunch, or hey, it's too burbly to land, they don't want you to force to land and wreck the plane, or to try to land long and end up, squealing your tires right through and stopping right in the middle of the intersection, right where that other guy's landing. They would rather that you go around and only cross that runway for just a brief second, going 70, 80, 90 miles an hour in your go around, and then simply enter the pattern. And as always goes, you aviate, navigate, communicate, you clean up the airplane, you add full power, you get established in your climb out, and then you notify the tower as soon as you can that, hey, Cessna 12345 is going around. And hey, maybe by the time you go around, you won't have to land and hold short the next time. Maybe the other guy will already be down and clear. So perfectly okay to accept a go around after, or to go around after accepting the land and hold short clearance. How would you know? Say you're on left downwind for runway 17, and they say, hey, can you land and hold short of runway 26 right? And you're like, man, my personal minimum is a 4,000 foot long runway with this wind and this density altitude. How do you know how much distance is available to land and hold short? What's the quickest way to find out when you're midfield left downwind and the tower just asks you if you can land and hold short? How would you find out that number? What's the available landing distance?
Ask the tower.
Yeah, key up the mic and say, I'd love to land and hold short. What's my available landing distance? How much distance do I have? They're going to rattle off that number immediately to you. You can try to thumb through your iPad and try to look stuff up and get all distracted and start swerving all over the pattern and be all over the place where you're not supposed to be, or just ask the tower, hey, you want me to land and hold short? Cool. What's the available landing distance? What's the ALD or available landing distance? How much room do I have, before that? However you want to say it to them. Just communicate that to them, and they'll give you the number right away. So
2 comments on that, John. Even if they're asking you if you'll take an intersection departure, that's also fair to ask them. Well,
certainly.
How long is it from this intersection?
Yep. And just a small story, just food for thought. I don't take intersection departures often. I will take an intersection departure in my little Rans S20. The reason is the stall speed's 32 miles an hour. I can land it in under 100 feet on pretty much any given day with any sort of wind on the nose. If I got 5 knots of wind, I'll land that thing in less than 100 feet. So I'm pretty comfortable if I take off of this runway and have an engine failure with an intersection departure, I'm going to be able to make that impossible turn back. I only need, 300 feet or so to turn back to the runway and make it. So I might take an intersection departure with that. But with a Piper Cherokee or any other airplane that doesn't climb quite as well, doesn't land quite as short, I don't take intersection departures with 172s or Cherokees and stuff like that. Reason is I was at an airport much like this. I had about 150 hours in my book, building up some cross-country time. and the FBO is located over here by Alpha 12, and they're departing, say, 8 right. And I'm taxiing out behind a Dash 8 that's taxiing out full length all the way to Alpha 1, and I don't want to go. I know that I can take off from Alpha 10 and be good. I can take off from Alpha 9 and be good. And so I asked the tower, I asked them again, I asked them 3 times, talking to ground control anyways, can I get an intersection departure? No, follow the Dash 8. And so then now I'm stuck behind this Dash 8. They get their IFR clearance. They take off. I wait 2 minutes for wake turbulence. Then I take off, and I'm just annoyed that I wasted 12 minutes taxiing, 2 miles behind this guy. And I just think it's the dumbest thing ever because I got 150 hours. I was 20 years old, and I was the best pilot there was at age 20 and 150 hours, of course. Anyway, so I took off. I used only about 1,000 feet of the runway, rotated, got to 50 feet, and the engine kind of hiccuped a little bit. I was like, oh, that's not good. It was making full power again. And then it just stopped because I got fuel that night before and there was water in the fuel. When I went to sup the tanks, not a great thing to admit, but that was a piece of junk Piper Cherokee. I was building flight time. I was broke and 20 years old. The fuel sumps were rusted shut on that airplane. So I never bothered to sump the tanks because if I tried to, I knew that they would probably either break off or, just never seal back up. But I was renting from the cheapest flight school I could, and that's what it was. So anyways, I land on that remaining, 8,000 feet of runway in front of me uneventfully, and the tower just, smugly comes on, same guy from ground control and tower, and says, well, you need any assistance? I'm like, yeah, send a tug. And he goes, oh, bet you're glad you didn't take that intersection departure, huh? And yeah, I kind of was. It was a big learning experience because in something like a Rand's or Steve Henry's, climb at 4,000 feet a minute, Highlander airplane, sure, you can take an intersection departure. You'll be high enough and land short enough that you can figure it out. In most of the airplanes we fly, runway behind you is useless. And even though it might sometimes, maybe you want full length and it just helps the tower out, so they want you to take an intersection departure. Just think about, if that engine quits and you don't have any runway in front of you, where are you going to go? And if you got nothing but fields in front of you and you're comfortable breaking off a nose gear in a field, fine, go for it, have at it. But just really think about it. There might be one day where you really are appreciative you got some runway in front of you to work with until you achieve a high enough altitude that you can come back around and make a safe landing otherwise. So a little story, a little embarrassing story from back in the day, 10 years ago or whatever. So
the other comment I wanted to make, John, was that as the PIC, you regs kind of go out the window if flight safety is involved, right? I mean, if you're going to crash and die trying to follow the regs, you as the PIC have the right to do whatever you need to do.
Oh, absolutely. Yep. Yeah. And I mean, if they don't want to give you an intersection departure or they don't want to give you full length, you can always, say, no, I need it. And it might be a little delay, but you'll get it. If you take off and you can't make it back to the runway, but you can make it onto a taxiway, great. I mean, who cares? Like, I don't care about any airplane I fly. They can all be replaced. And so, yeah, I mean, there's, just always do what's safe and, what makes the most sense. Never try to save a plane or try to, make somebody else's life easier and load yourself up with a big workload or stress. Typically doesn't go over so well. A big one with that is trying to expedite, off runways, especially with tailwheel airplanes or even just 172s, expedite, get off the runway immediately, expedite next taxiway. And people turn off too fast. They wind up tipping over, dipping a wing, or they can't make the turn. The brakes aren't as good as they thought, and they start, they slide a little bit and they run off, hit a taxiway light or something. And the FAA pins it on you. They're not going to pin it on the controller. So always do what you got to do to fly safe and keep safety the number one priority. I would like to know though, next question, is there more than one definition of night? And how many are there?
I think there's 3, as I recall.
There would be 3, yeah. And the 3, there's really 3 in the real world and then 3 in the FAA. That's a little bit different. But what we've got is sunset, we've got civil twilight, and then we've got 1 hour before, 1 hour after sunset and sunrise, or the 3 that the FAA really looks at. Now, in the real world, we talk about civil, nautical, astronomical, twilight, are the three different definitions of night. But in the FAA world, we're talking about, hey, are we doing these takeoffs and landings 1 hour after sunset or 1 hour before sunrise? Sunset has some regulatory implications with it. And then the actual, civil twilight and everything when it's actually physically dark. So civil twilight is when we're going to log nighttime, and then sunset is, some other things happen there that we'll talk about in the next question here. And then with the 1 hour before, 1 hour after, of course, is when we can log those night currency landings. Talking about another nighttime reg here. When do you have to turn on your position lights legally, your navigation lights?
I think
night.
it's actual sunset.
Actual
Yeah,
sunset.
I think it is actual sunset.
Yep, at sunset, exactly. So, yep, right at sunset is when you want to turn them on. And yeah, it's a funny question to ask in Alaska because people are like, navigation lights, what are those? We never, most people, fly just in the summers up there and never gets dark, so it's never an issue. But the actual reg for your position lights is going to be sunset. How about this one? This one is a little bit more interesting. We all pre-flight our airplanes. We've all done it. We've all moved the ailerons up and down. We move the stabilator, the elevator up and down. We move the rudder left and right. We check the flight controls. We make sure they're free and correct and all that good stuff. How do you actually know if they're moving far enough? How do you know that that aileron is moving up and down as much as it is supposed to? How do you know that it's not moving up and down too much? Or
They go to the limit.
they go to the limit. Okay, how do you know that the limit is set correctly?
Because it's checked at annual inspection,
Okay,
and it usually has some kind of set on it so you can a witness so you can tell if it moved or not.
gotcha. And how do you know that the A&P did their job? I mean, or the IA did their job?
If you truly believe.
Because I can show you pictures of airplanes that I've flown that came out of maintenance that yeah, I mean, I'm kind of lucky to still be alive after what some of those guys did, and not, blaming them too much. I mean, people make mistakes, but some of the mistakes they did, like rigging flight controls backwards, it would be awful confusing for me to try to fly an airplane with my ailerons rigged backwards like they did, or when they rigged my trim tab backwards. And, I might be giving it a little nose up trim, and man, it's getting really hard to fly this thing, or give it a little nose down trim, and man, it really wants to pitch up. Let me give it more nose down trim until this thing just goes into a trim stall. But they've rigged a lot of stuff backwards on me, and a lot of things I don't quite trust them just that much. So how do you, when you go and you show up to buy an airplane, you show up to rent a new airplane from a flight school, you check that thing, how do you know that rudder is moving as much as it's supposed to? I mean, in fact, there's ADs on some of those Cessna rudders about their movement because of how they recover from spins. The rudder needs to be able to move enough to be able to recover from a spin. So what document are you going to check that's going to tell you in degrees how much those flight controls are supposed to be moving? Any guesses?
Well, that probably go back to the type certificate.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
TCDS.
Yeah, so you won't find it in your POH, but you will find it in the type certificate data sheet. And so let's jump back over there. So we got our type certificate data sheet. And if we scroll down just a little bit, it's going to tell us things like wing flaps. Of course, we know, 0, 10, 20, 30, 40. That makes good sense. But here, control surfaces, ailerons up 20, down 14. Elevator tab, basically your trim tab, up 28, down 13. Elevator 28 and 26. Rudder left and right 16 degrees. So those are the numbers, and it's going to have serial numbers here. Eligible for these serial numbers. Different serial numbers may be different amounts. And you can measure that, with a protractor. You can get those digital little levels. Heck, some of our cell phones have apps in them that are fairly accurate now to measure these things. So if you walk up to an airplane and you move that aileron up and down, and maybe it doesn't hit the stops, maybe it just gets kind of tighter to press, and you're like, it's just kind of a lot of friction in old airplane. And I wonder if is that what it's supposed to be doing? This is how you'd go about measuring it. I walked up to an airplane in Alaska on the ramp to a 206, and I go, oh my God, that trim tab got, hit. Somebody must have backed a fuel truck into it. It's way off. And we pulled up the type certificate data sheet, And this is back in 2017 when I made my first trip to Alaska. And I'm looking at the thing, with the 206 pilot, and he's going, yeah, that does look kind of weird, I guess, now that you mention it. And we pull up the type certificate data sheet and we go, oh yeah, it's supposed to go up 28 and down 13, but this thing, is going up like, 40 degrees and only down, 2 degrees. That's not right. And we call the mechanic over and tell him, and he looks at it and he looks at me and he laughs and he goes, you're not from around here, are you? And no, actually from Florida originally. And he goes, yeah, we do things different here. We overload these things way over gross weight, way out of CG, and we need that trim tab for all that extra weight we put in the back there. I was like, oh, okay, I guess that's how you're going to do it. So not remotely legal and has some implications for how the airplane flies. I guess that's how they were flying that particular one at that operator. Mind you, the vast majority of accidents in Alaska are due to either low visibility or in controlled flight into terrain, or flying overweight is the other half of the accidents up there. But that's where you would find these things when you're doing your pre-flight and you're wondering if that airplane is actually set up the way it's supposed to be. So type data sheet's a pretty useful document to get familiar with if you haven't already for your particular airplane. Just it's a short read. For your airplanes, can be like 2 pages at most, and you might find some cool things in there. Any questions on that?
I'd make a comment.
Yep.
Not to give a plug to a competitor, John, but the Pilot Workshops Real World VFR had a monthly issue a number of months ago about misrigged after maintenance, where somebody taking off very close to O'Hare Airport in Illinois, near Chicago, found out that they had reversed his controls. So
yeah,
what to do was the question that they talked about.
Yeah, that same thing happened. Spirit Airlines pilot down in Florida spent years rebuilding a Cub, and on his first flight, he killed himself. Pushing that nose stick as far forward as he could, try and get the nose down. Flight controls were reversed. So, and I've gone through phases. I'll perfectly admit that there's been times where I do a flight control check, and I just kind of look at the shadows on the ground, and I see the controls are moving. I don't physically look back there and check. It's an important thing to check. And you can say, oh, I flew the airplane, earlier today, earlier whenever. If you do the exact same thing every flight, it's really easy to do the exact same thing every flight. And obviously, if you just fly out for a $100 hamburger and you walk back out to the airplane an hour later, the flight controls are not going to be reversed. Doesn't mean you shouldn't do the same check that you always do and visually check when you're sitting in the cockpit, turn your head around, twist in the seat, do all that stuff to actually see. Just be in that habit, because there's been times where I get into an airplane and it has just come out of maintenance. And if I'm not in that habit, then yeah, I might forget to do it. And the elevator being reversed, I caught. The ailerons being reversed, I caught. The trim tab being reversed, I did not catch. And that sucked. Luckily, it's a trim tab, and I just stopped touching things and came back around, landed. When I reduced power, things got a little easier to fly. And that was that. But there's been other things that have come out of maintenance where they've sealed up, flight controls where there hasn't been bolts put through pulleys, in the empennage. Obviously, you're not going to check all that stuff on your pre-flight, but on your first flight out of maintenance, yeah, I do pull bulkheads and look back in the empennage. I look in the wings. I don't trust anybody. And not that, I'm using bad mechanics or they're bad guys or anything like that. People make mistakes, and I'm not gonna die because of it. So once you have enough of that stuff show up, you kind of realize like, hey, aviation is just not the fastest way to get around. It takes time to do this right. You really do have to pre-flight and slow things down and make sure that it's not going to bite you. It's not something to be scared of, but just, you put the time in to make sure you're not going to get any nasty surprises.
It even happened to an
For that,
F-16.
there's a mnemonic that's very easy to remember when you're doing the flight controls free and correct. This is the correct part of it. Left up mine and right up yours.
Yeah. What was that other question there?
I think it's the same thing happened, reverse controls on an F-16, and it went into the ground, and then subsequently the crew chief committed suicide.
Yeah, no, it's a nasty thing, when have I ever had these talks with, because I've had multiple maintenance issues only once did I ever have, you know, an A&P that was pretty defensive about it. And it's like, and he had made a lot of mistakes with the plane. It was a kit that he had built. And I mean, they were really egregious mistakes. And they're still looking at, that was just last year. And so they're still looking at taking his certificate over it. But he was, I mean, you know, it's a mistake. I get it. But everybody else I've ever approached about it, I would feel terrible. I mean, I do a lot of maintenance on airplanes, and I would feel pretty bad, you know, sending something out to have somebody else get in it and have an issue. I don't think I've ever done maintenance on an airplane without me flying it first before somebody else flies it, because I'd like to find out, you know, me first before, you know, I put my girlfriend in it or something and tell her to go take it around the pattern. So, but in any case, moving on here, I don't want to take up too much of you guys' time tonight. So just a couple more questions for you. Can you log night flight time, but not be able to legally log a night landing for currency?
Well, yes, if you do a touch and go, right?
You're not back on the slide deck.
Go back?
You're not on the slide deck.
Oh, I'm not on the slide deck. Oh, thank you. Yep. I guess I should pay more attention to that. Pretty new to Zoom, believe it or not. Despite all this COVID stuff, I do a pretty good job of staying off of Zoom and meetings and all that. So here's the
start to play.
So yeah, one of those things I was mentioning is correct. If you do a touch and go, nope, it would not legally count. What would be the other way that it wouldn't legally count? Say if sunset was 7 p.m., civil twilight is 7:15, and you know we're out there flying at 7:30. It's legally nighttime, and we're logging nighttime. Can we log the night landing at 7:30?
You're not an hour after.
Not an hour after. Yep. So that's the other gotcha. So you can legally log night flight time, but not be logging a night landing. So just something to keep in mind as the days are getting a little longer here. But if you're you know, still trying to stay night current, it's funny. People in Alaska, of course, people don't really worry too much about staying night current at all, you know, for a big chunk of the year. Nobody's really flying at, you know, when it is nighttime at 1 a.m. or 2 a.m. legally. But of course, in Colorado, you guys have night year round. Next question, can you fly in the daytime with a burnt out landing light? Say on your Piper Cherokee or your 172.
Well, what's required for legal flight in the POH or the STC?
Yeah, exactly. So we're looking at 91.213 for inoperative equipment. We're also looking at 91.205 for what's required. We know tomato flames, hey, it's not required, you know, for daytime flight. Not even required for nighttime flight unless it's for hire. But what about the POH? You know, what about the manufacturer is really the right way to address it. So does the manufacturer in the type certificate data sheet or in the POH or in any other document specifically call out a landing light for daytime flight? And we, you know, for your average Piper Cherokee or 172, they don't. The next place we would want to check is any airworthiness directives. You know, so is this required by an airworthiness directive for us to have this operating on the aircraft? And we would do an AD search and we'd find out, hey, you know, it's not, you know, there's no AD for this. So at this point, and we know it's not legally required, can we just go fly or do we have to do anything before we go fly?
Mark it as an operative.
It would have to be marked as an operative, but this is where it gets a little tricky here. And so different FSDOs, shocker, have different interpretations of this. Isn't that wonderful that we as pilots get to deal with not always the most complete or most really consistent regulations. So inoperative instruments and equipment, we come down here and what we'll find is this is where they get hung up, that it has to be that maintenance, if deactivation of the unoperative equipment or instrument or equipment involves maintenance, it must be accomplished and recorded in accordance with Part 43 of this chapter. This is where they're getting a little confused. They're like, well, if you pop a circuit breaker that's in zip tie it, that's considered maintenance to deactivate that landing light. So it must be accomplished in accordance with Part 43 of this chapter. Part 43 of this chapter is the maintenance section. By the way, ecfr.gov is what I use all the time because your paper FAR AIM, well, that's out of date the moment they print it. ecfr.gov, obviously its website's updated all the time. So if we look at Part 43, we're all familiar with preventative maintenance, and we come down here to Appendix A. And when we come down to preventative maintenance, it covers, about, 20, 30 things here. that says that we can do, like replacing bulbs, reflectors, and lenses of position and landing lights. We can replace wheel skis where no weight and balance computations involved. Shockingly enough, we can replace seat belts. I feel like somebody that's really proficient in doing that should do so. We can replace landing gear shock cords. We can replace tires. Nowhere on here in preventive maintenance does it say that we as pilots can pop a circuit breaker and zip tie it or collar it. And so some FSDOs decide that, oh, for anything that's inoperative basically on your airplane, there's no way you can legally fly that airplane without getting a mechanic out there to do X, Y, and Z, or at least sign it off. You might do X, Y, and Z, and then he signs off that he's done that, and he finds the aircraft safe for flight and records that maintenance in the logbooks in accordance with Part 43 of this chapter.
I got burned on my commercial for that exact question.
And you know what? What's so sad is that, you know, some DPEs in the country would tell you you're totally wrong. No, you can totally do that yourself. You know, you can do that yourself. Other DPs will tell you, no, you have to get the mechanic involved. It varies around the country. Obviously, the safe way is get the mechanic involved. Now, the best answer to this particular question is forget about deactivating it. Go replace the bulb. You know, if you got an extra one on the shelf, you can replace the bulb yourself, and you can record that maintenance in the logbooks yourself under preventive maintenance. But you can't go fly it with a burnt out light bulb yourself. You know, is kind of the goofiness of it. But as we all know, the FAA is not exactly known for making sense all the time. So just something to keep in mind, especially when you're chatting with your friendly FSDO buddies and you're talking about, you know, broken things on airplanes or people are listening, that you make sure you're, if you know the right way anyways, you can at least say the right thing and not get, not get burned on stuff and say, oh yeah, I just fly with, it's been burnt out for weeks and I've been flying, and somebody goes, hey, you're not really supposed to do that. They're not looking to take anybody's certificate over stuff like this, but you know, it's best to do it the right way. And then it's also best to know the right way. So at least you're not, you know, going out there telling everybody you're doing the wrong thing. But that depends on their interpretation of it. Here's a little scenario for you. What do you do when your flaps do not retract on takeoff? So we'll talk about a Cessna or an electronic flap airplane first. So you set flaps 10 for takeoff because you're doing say a short field takeoff or soft field takeoff, and you get up to 500 feet, you go to retract the flaps, they don't come up. What are you going to do?
Stay in the white arc and fly around and land?
Sure. Are you going to leave the flap selector set to 0? Because that's, you know, you flipped it to 0 and they didn't come up. Are you going to leave it there? Or are you going to move it back to the 10-degree notch?
I
Put it
probably
back
would.
to where it was.
Well, and so you would want to put that thing back to the 10-degree notch, and here's why. What if it's just a loose wire and you move it to 0, you come back around, and right as you're flaring, you know, at 10, 20 feet, you're starting to kind of level off, the flaps go from 10 to 0. Finally, the wires touch, and boom, you got, you know, your flaps just retracted, you sink pretty rapidly there. So that would be a reason to push the flap selector back to where they are stuck at. And believe it or not, that's the procedure in a CRJ 900. You know, when I was flying for the airlines, flying that stuff, if we had a flap, you know, that wouldn't respond, that was the first thing in the QRH or in that, you know, in the handbook, was put the flap selector back to where the flaps are stuck at in case it starts working again. Next thing you can potentially do, if you got time and you know where it is, you could pop that circuit breaker for the flaps to really make sure that they're not going to move around on you. You stay in the white arc, you come around and land, and you bring it into maintenance. But let's talk about something like a Piper with manual flaps. So you pull that handle and you set it to, say, 25 degrees, like you're supposed to for a short field takeoff. And you go to push that flap lever down, you push it down, and they don't retract. What would you do in that case? Would you leave the flap lever at 0? Or would you pop it back to the 25-degree mark?
These are hard questions.
Piper pilots.
They're
Piper
stumper
pilots.
questions.
I think for the same reasons you'd leave it at 25.
Exactly. Yep. You would want to set it back.
Could be
You go
hung up, just friction and, you know,
exactly
cables, and there's sears, and, you know, and it could just be sitting there hanging by a thread, and
exactly.
you don't want to be surprised. So
Right. Yep. So you would set that thing back to 25 because by setting it to 0, maybe you let the cables go slack, but there's friction in the system and it's, hung up on something. And maybe it's not friction. Maybe a bolt came loose from something. Now it's jammed in there. You don't want it to become unjammed right when you're coming back around to land. So anytime you have a flap condition where it's not, the flaps aren't responding, put that flap selector back to where it should be. If you go to set 10 flaps or, full flaps for landing, and they don't respond, put them back to where the flaps are. If they're stuck at 10, put them 10. If they're stuck at 0, set to 0 and make your landing that way so you don't have anything unexpected to you. You at least know the situation you're in and you can deal with it rather than having any unexpected scenarios pop up. Next question for you. Last aircraft calling tower, that was carrier only. What does the tower mean by that?
They can tell that you're transmitting, but they don't hear any audio.
Right. So somebody keyed the mic, but probably, so if you called the tower and you just told them Cessna 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 south, landing with echo, and they called back and they say last aircraft calling tower, that was carrier only, what would you check in your airplane?
Make sure your mic is plugged in.
Make sure the mic's plugged in. What else would you check? This was,
And
by the
what's-
way, here's the scenario. It's a long cross country. Now you're coming into land. What else would you check?
Volumes turned up.
The volume, but the volume wouldn't affect them being able to hear you. It's just a microphone issue. So the volume could be that, you wouldn't hear them ever say anything, but what else could it be? It's a really dumb thing. And I'm saying it because I did it.
oh, the boom mic on your headset, so against
You
your
got
throat.
hungry. You got
Yeah,
thirsty. You
moved
were
it down
eating.
to
You were
your
drinking.
throat, and it's
You weren't
like
talking
way
to
away
anybody.
from your mouth. Right.
Yeah, it's way up away from your mouth. And you know what? I hate to tell you, I've done it more than once. Probably only twice, but I'm pretty sure I did that at least once or twice in the airlines and at least once in GA flying, where I'd keyed the mic and gave my whole spiel, and they're like, can barely hear you, or that was carrier only. And I'm like, oh man, great. Should probably put. The worst thing is, I've watched a student do it, and I purposely, when I'm flying with students on flight reviews, I'll make them do this stuff. Say, hey, you want a drink of water? Right before they're about to call the tower. Cool. Oh, get that microphone out of your way. Here, take a drink of water. Okay, can you call the tower right now? And while it's tilted up, they call a tower, and I just look at them. They try it again, and they try it again. And what's going on, man? Then they realize, and maybe I'm just a jerk, but I try to do these things with students because I want to see them make these mistakes with me on board, and rather than making their mistakes, when they got friends or family on board and all that. So
Watch
You're a
it
hard
put
man,
on the wrong
Joe.
radio on the wrong frequency.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, there's a number of different ways to mess up the radio. Wrong frequency, volume turned down, your audio panel, set wrong, all sorts of stuff. So, mic jacks are definitely a big one. If you twist around in there, can certainly do it. So, last question of the night for you guys. Where do you find the tire pressure to inflate your tire to?
On the
Please.
That's
POH.
the POH.
In the POH. Yep. Very good. Don't tell me that's on the tire, because that tire goes on more than one type of aircraft, and different airplanes have different tire pressures.
Where do you find it
So-
on a car?
Well, yeah. And so it's same thing. People, I've asked students that, they tell me, oh, it's on the side of the tire. I'm like, how do you find the tire pressure in your car? Well, it's on the side of the tire. Oh man, what's your tire pressure? 50 PSI right now. It's supposed to be like 32. Yeah, it's the mins and maxes should be on the tire. And just so you know, overinflated tires are bad. Underinflated tires, way worse, for a lot of different reasons. Slicing valve stems, and damaging your tube, and just the tire itself can get damaged and blow out very easily when it's underinflated. Overinflated, not good, but not as bad as underinflated. And so those mins and maxes on the side of the tire are good for something, but definitely check that POH. And if for some reason it doesn't agree, like the POH calls for 35 PSI and the tire says max 30, you probably got the wrong tire on the airplane. And I've seen that more than once. So doesn't mean inflate the tire to 35 like the POH says. Doesn't mean inflate to 30 like the tire says. Means go back and look at what tires are approved for that airplane. In that case, you wouldn't be looking at your type certificate data sheet. You'd look at the data sheet for the tire. And usually Aircraft Spruce is pretty good about providing those, or the manufacturer is good about providing those right from Goodyear, from AirTrack, or whoever, and saying what airplanes they are PMA approved for, and checking that your make and model or your serial number is actually on that list. So any questions from anything we talked about tonight? No, cool, all good. I appreciate you guys taking the time. Hopefully, hopefully you learned something. Hopefully it
I
was
think for me that it was the type certificate data sheet. That was the big one for me.
yeah, that's a really good document. And that RPM, man, I'm telling you, if you fly long enough, you'll fly piece of junk airplanes. I mean, even if it's a good airplane, doesn't mean anything. Low RPM on takeoff doesn't mean, oh, I'm heavy, doesn't mean, the tack's not working right. It means something's wrong, and you don't need to worry about what's wrong. You just need to abort the takeoff and take it back in and figure out what's going on.
Well, about 2 summers ago, I went down to Florida and I flew a little bit down there, and doing a takeoff down there, I thought I was in a jet. It was
Yeah.
amazing compared to
Come
flying
to
out
Alaska. We've got negative 2,000 feet density altitude in July. Yeah, it's in the wintertime, it'll get down to, negative 3,000 feet or so, negative 4,000. But yeah, that performance is pretty good. And to that effect, if you guys, something to remember is, our engines are certified to sea level. We don't want to push them too hard. You can get 32, 33 inches of manifold pressure pretty easily on any airplane, in Alaska. So that max RPM is a real thing. You don't want to call for too much power coming out of these engines. So cool. Any other questions? Any random questions that are bugging you guys that you want to try to trick me with? Any stumper questions you got for me at this point?
Well, one of the things that you mentioned earlier, and I was thinking about it, was the minimal equipment list.
Mm-hmm.
Or when we were talking about that light bulb on the landing light.
Yep.
Would that be another area to look for the particular aircraft? Would be the minimum equipment list?
Yep. And you rarely find, so a true MEL is something that is going to be specific to an airplane N number. So if I look up an MEL, it's going to be an FAA approved document for a specific N number. And man, it takes a lot of time and money to get those. So our airplanes don't have them. What we have typically is something like a weight and balance. So a weight and balance chart will often have like an R or O next to it. And let me see if I can find something here. Weight and balance equipment list. This might have it. Nope. But that R or O will be kind of your minimum equipment list, so to speak, for your airplane. Then there's types of equipment, or KOEL, kinds of equipment list for kinds of operation. And a KOEL, sometimes you'll get those with Cirruses and the fancier airplanes where they say, day VFR, no attitude indicator required. Day IFR, kind of operation, KOEL, attitude indicator is required. So depends what your airplane has. It does get very gray with the FAA as far as what has to be in there, but the bare minimum is 91205, what's required in your POH and by the manufacturer, in any sort of weight and balance data sheets you have that tells you, R or O for required or optional. And if you ask somebody, for a minimum equipment list for their 172 and they hand you something, it probably is not a legitimate minimum equipment list per the FAA. So because it would actually have an N number on it and it would be very specific to that airplane. Kind of equipment list is,
and they're issued by the local FSDO.
they are issued by the local FSDO, and that's where these things get really gray.
That's why,
You talk about like a 1962 172 panel and you say, oh, I don't have an amp meter in here. Do I need one? And they say, oh, well, if it left the factory with it, then you need one. Tell me how it left the factory. And they flat out can't. Because these type certificate data sheets, at the end of it, what it says, it's got a bunch of regs in here of how these airplanes comply. So it complies with all these regs, and all these regs, like 21 or 23.623, will say something along the lines of, oh, you need to have a magnetic direction indicator, meaning you need to have, a compass. But does that mean a compass, that's vertical card? Does that mean, a regular old whiskey compass? What does it mean? And they say, oh, well, how it left the factory. And that means that Cessna, for example, would have documentation of how they complied with this stuff. And so you'd have to go back to Cessna or go back to the FAA archives, probably on microfiche in Oklahoma or DC, and see how do they comply with these regs what equipment did they put in the airplane? Was there an amp meter there in the first place or not? Thus, do I need it or not? And you get so far down deep the rabbit hole with this stuff that the vast majority of the time they kind of overlook it. They're looking for tomato flames, is really what they're looking for. And then, of course, in our newer airplanes, we have better documentation. But they never thought that these 1930 Pipers were still going to be flying. And so they didn't do a very good job saving the documentation for them. And all your 1930s and some of your early 40s aircraft were certified under CAR, not even, FAR stuff. So totally different set of regs. Hopefully that's a long answer to that question. So.
But if somebody says they got an MEL for 172, they probably don't know what they're talking about.
Correct. Yeah, they probably don't. And that's, if anything, it'd be a KOEL for like a brand new 172, or for older stuff, it's just gonna be a weight and balance sheet, that with all the different items on that with an R and O. So, yep, that is correct. Other stumper questions you guys got for me? Nothing? Cool. Well,
I'd like to thank you on behalf of the CPA for taking the time to give us a very interesting and informative seminar. And
Really enjoyed it. Thank you.
CPA,
Yes, thank you very much,
glad
Don.
you joined us.
Yeah, well, thank you guys for tuning in. I'll give you my 10-second plug of, if you guys need any online courses, check out our website at flyatmikealf.com. And there's everything from private through CFI on there, Part 107 stuff. We're going to be adding a mountain flying course to that as well. There's tailwheel, seaplane, all that sort of stuff on there. And if you guys ever have any questions at all about anything aviation related, whether you're using one of our courses or not, you can always, come on down here into the bottom of the page. Telephone numbers on there, and feel free to reach out by phone, email, whatever. Anything we can do to answer your questions and keep you guys flying, just let us know. That's what we're here for.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I noticed you have over 125 videos on YouTube.
There should be about 400 or so on YouTube, and there's a little over 1,200 on the site that make up all our different courses.
Wow.
So a lot of information on there. Some of these things like for we have like a private pilot Checkride boot camp that's where some of these stumper questions come from. So in this Checkride boot camp, there's actually several videos of us going through and explaining all these. There's a lot more, obviously, but we covered what we could in kind of a shorter period of time here. But there's all sorts of stuff, like full length oral videos on there of private pilot check rides, and same thing for instrument, commercial, CFI, all the full length oral videos and the ground schools and written prep, all that good stuff. So, and if any of you guys ever do make it up to Alaska, we're in Anchorage from April onward each year. So feel free to reach out if you have any questions about the local area up there, flying around there. If you want to do the trip, from Colorado, going up the coast or going up the trench to Alaska and fly your airplane up there, feel free to reach out and can give you, some tips for what it's worth on how to do the trip safely, where good spots are for fuel, and good alternates are, and all that sort of stuff. Things get pretty spread out up in Alaska. So nearest fuel can be either 200 miles in front of you or 200 miles behind you.
Okay, thanks again, John. And if I'm ever in our aviation trivia contest, I want you on my team.
All right, sounds good. Thanks for tuning in, guys. We'll see y'all later.